Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic, the rise of political science news reporting. Sit back and relax and enjoy today's Daily Bolt. So, this podcast is a companion to the podcast immediately preceding it, where I was talking about, and maybe coined this term, political science organizations. Now I'm going to shift gears ever so slightly and talk about Politico-Science news reporting. This has been a factor in me starting this podcast in the first place, is bad science news reporting and over-exaggeration of weather information, alarmism, extremism, and it can be found almost daily on any number of news outlets, but one of the most egregious offenders is the Washington Post. And articles by one of the editors of the so-called Capital Weather Gang. Now, if you take a look at the Capital Weather Gang, you can find them at a website, capitalweathergang.com, as you might expect. There are some people there on the page that I have significant respect for. There are scientists who have had distinguished careers, who know all about scientific method and process, and who know how to write good science information. There are meteorologists that provide forecasts that have some training in forecasting and atmospheric science. There are also some other individuals on here, writers who have just had passing interests in weather and climate, who now have a much more focused interest because they're getting paid to write about it. We have a number of photographers who are basically there presumably to take pretty pictures and impressive pictures of various weather and climate phenomena, which is fine, provided that their expertise is really the photography end of things. And we have a few other individuals, and one in particular, who I'm going to call out by name, Andrew Friedman, who has much more questionable credentials and who certainly has a significant, at least apparent political bias in terms of the resume that he posts on his profile on the Washington Post. Let's talk about his qualifications. First of all, his education. He has a bachelor's in political science from Tufts University. He has a master's in a climate and society program from Columbia, and a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School. And quite frankly, all these institutions are well known in academia as being liberal organizations. They often take positions well on the political left. And when we look actually at what Friedman's main background appears to be, it's much more in politics and in policy. And his career is really an interesting mashup of things. He's worked for Axios, which is not necessarily known for being a fair and balanced news outlet. Mashable, the same way. Climate Central, perhaps a little more neutral, and other publications. He was the person who made the big splash in 2013 of the whole polar vortex, craze, and got everybody thinking that it was going to be the end of the world with this polar vortex, which is something that is a natural, reoccurring phenomena, recurs almost every year, but he made a big alarmist, extremist deal of it. And I groaned at the time when it happened. I know many of my colleagues in the atmospheric sciences groaned at the time and did not like the exaggeration and the mischaracterization. And yet that hasn't stopped him. And in fact, the Washington Post seemed fit to feel that he is, just the perfect voice for them, even though his real science credentials are extremely minimal. A climate and society degree at Columbia, which is as much focused on policy implications as anything else, rather than the hard science, does not necessarily give him a great basis, as far as I'm concerned, for writing about technical issues. But you may say, I'm being too harsh on him. I'm being, rougher than I should be. I shouldn't expect actual scientists to be writing science news. And that's probably true to a point. It's a shame because there are many scientists who communicate well and who could actually do a terrific job. And there are some scientists in various parts of the country who have done a terrific job of being in public media and accurately communicating science information. Paul Douglas comes to mind. There are some others. But maybe the best thing for me to do is to look at some of Mr. Friedman's recent work for the Washington Post. And in particular, there was an article 2 weeks ago that dealt with the issue of Tropical Storm Imelda. Hurricane Harvey from 2017 was also brought up, but it was primarily an article that focused on the recent flooding dealing with Tropical Storm Imelda in the Houston metropolitan area, which was not quite as bad as Harvey's, but nonetheless, it was a very impressive rainfall total, and there's still a lot of research that's being done on Imelda. And a lot of this research will be reported, I am sure, at sessions at American Meteorological Society and American Geophysical Union conferences this winter and into the spring. And nonetheless, however, Mr. Friedman seems to, when you read through this article, and you can find it if you search for it, it has a title, Climate Change More Than Doubled the Odds of Houston's Most Recent Deluge, Study Finds. So he's taking a look at one study by one group. The study has not been peer-reviewed. It's probably barely had much in the way of serious examination by the scientific community, and it is done by a consortium known as World Weather Attribution, which conducts rapid analyses of weather and how climate change played a role in extreme weather events. So this comes back now to yesterday's podcast, where I'm talking about politico-scientific organizations. I don't know a lot about this World Weather Attribution outfit. It's something I will look into over the next few days. However, I do know that this emerging field of fast attribution, it heavily leverages assumptions that are not necessarily proven facts or even strongly based in theory. And to do this type of attribution work fast, you have to make a lot of simplifying assumptions, because the Earth climate system is complicated, and unless this group has more powerful supercomputers than are available to most of the scientific research community, which I doubt, then they are basically doing the most simplest of analysis. I'm going to take a closer look at this paper and probably report on it in a future podcast. That's not my focus for this particular podcast. What I am focusing on is the fact that we have someone who claims to be a science writer who takes a study that has not been peer-reviewed and then further uses inflammatory language in the article. At one point, he makes the point that the storm was supercharged by a warming climate. That's a deliberately provocative term. Most scientists that I know, unless they're trying to make a political point, would never use that terminology in any sort of technical recourse. Why does Friedman use it here? It sells newspapers. That's why the Washington Post wants him, because he can be sensationalistic and sell newspapers, and, accuracy of the science be damned, as far as that's concerned. So there's also a number, if you read through the article, I'm not going to read through it all for you, but I will point out the fact that there are some incorrect causal relationships that are presented in here. Let me see, I'm going to scroll through this while I am reading this to see if I can find the one that's... okay. Continuing, I was pausing while I was looking through the article there, and really this sentence, which uses the term supercharged, is the one that suggests a causal relationship that really cannot be demonstrated by the methods that are used. Let me talk about these methods a little bit. It's mostly statistical. They're looking at probabilities, and Friedman makes a big deal about how probability is going up by a factor of 2 or a factor of 3. But he doesn't say what those probabilities are to begin with. They can be quite small. The Imelda rainfall has been estimated by hydrologists is a flooding event that would have a return period once in 1,200 years. What does that make the probability of such an event? Very low. Definitely, we're not talking a 10% chance here. We're not talking a 5% chance. We're talking much less than a 1% chance. So, if you double or triple a much less than 1% chance, what do you have? Still, much less than a 1% chance. Is this enough to be alarmist about? Is this enough to use language that is intended to get people all worked up? And if you read the article, and I will post the link to this article, the URL, on my Facebook page just after this post, and I'll let you read for itself. There is certainly an intention here to advocate about climate change. The language that he uses is just too obvious in that regard. And yet there's all sorts of conclusions that really can't be all that substantiated. In particular, this whole notion of doing fast attribution, it is still in its infancy. What does he say? The methods are well established, suggesting that this has been going on for a long time. It's had lots of peer review, and it hasn't. It's had a small amount of peer review compared to what we know about the atmosphere in many studies over many decades. Is that really enough to start making all sorts of claims about? I would probably say no, and most serious scientists would probably say no. But it's very clear. Again, there's other issues with this article. It may not be his most blatant effort at being sensationalistic. The whole polar vortex thing that he started with probably takes the cake for that. Nonetheless, you're seeing a rise in science writing in major newspapers that may be more motivated out of someone's political leanings as opposed to scientific fact. This is a change from what we've seen in newspapers especially, which have been holding on longer to having more reputable experts talking about the science. And I suspect that things that are written by many of the other folks in the Capital Weather Gang are just fine. But this is the guy that's getting all the attention and all the press outside the Washington metro area because of headlines that are designed to sell newspapers. Again, just like my message from the last podcast, buyer beware. That's all for this edition of the Daily Bolt. I'm Dr. Jeff Tilley. Have a good night, good morning, or good afternoon, and God bless.